So this is 6 minutes to 5 GMT on Thursday, the 18th of August 2022. This is the Khoodeelaar television channel being broadcast online only on the internet, not on satellite, not on terrestrial, not on the cable networks. The Khoodeelaar television channel is being broadcast at the start of the day, on Thursday. So we've got on the menu in this edition several items to update on and several items to introduce. But the main thing is that we're doing that as an original addition to the previous part and previous parts of the broadcast. Whichever subject, whichever topic that we are dealing with here. So we are broadcasting on the Baby Angel Geronimo editions of the Khoodeelaar television channel, and we are including the new movement for the purpose of the broadcast, of this broadcast or these broadcasts. End hunger at root. End hunger at root was devised by me as a slogan following a meeting held on the 3rd of September 2019. But based on the various activities and campaigns that I had been doing, for example, the one that I had done in the immediate aftermath, 24 hours after the cyclone of the 30th of April 1991 hit the southern coastlines of Bangladesh. And then I took a hastily drafted delegation, formal delegation, to hand a formal letter of demands for action in helping Bangladesh, which letter we delivered at number 10 Downing Street on the 4th of May 1991. That particular delegation visiting there, number 10 Downing Street, was the first item in the main news in the evening of the 4th of May 1991, as carried on the BBC News Network across the world. And the demand that I had actually put had been written by hand while we were waiting to be allowed into the Downing Street estate. I had written by hand with pen on a piece of paper the demand, which was not being completed in writing because writing the demand, incorporating all the contents and components would have taken much longer than the time we had. And we had to rush into the Downing Street through the security gate, let in by the police. So that was the news item. That was the main news item broadcast by the BBC in the main evening news. That evening news edition, that evening news edition was presented by a man called Clarence Mitchell. I think it's Clarence Mitchell was the BBC News presenter of that particular main news edition of that evening. Clarence is no longer working for the BBC. He has since tried to stand as a candidate for the Conservative Party, I think, or other party, not Labour Party, for Parliament. So that was in 1991. So this is now 31 years, 31 years ago. 30 years ago, I think 30 years ago it would be correct to say, was it January 1992, I broadcast an item called The Slot. I wrote that broadcast and I edited that broadcast and I presented that on the slot called The Slot. That was broadcast usually, the slot that is not my particular edition, at the end of the Channel 4 mainstream news that was locally broadcast at local time 1900 hours in the UK. So that slot was dedicated to my telling the world leadership as represented at the United Nations General Assembly. And I did that by focusing on the UK's role or turn as the chair of the General Assembly for that year. And the chair of the United Kingdom's membership of the General Assembly was being implemented by then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, John Major. And in January 1992, John Major was on his way to New York, where the United Nations headquarters is based, to chair the General Assembly as the UK's Prime Minister representing the UK at the General Assembly. And copies of John Major's main points in the forthcoming speech that he was going to deliver at the United Nations had already been discreetly made available to the UK media, the world media, which emphasized the threat as the particularly leaked speech treated it, the threat posed by the aspiring countries, newly kind of empowered parties that wanted or were aspiring to acquire nuclear weapons. Now, that is to be seen in the context and as a contrast, in the context of and as in contrast with the massive nuclear arsenal already owned by the Security Council members of the United Nations, namely the United States, followed by the Russians, followed by the Chinese, followed by the Chinese, followed by the Chinese, followed by the French, and followed by the United Kingdom. Now, no matter what the difference in the numbers of the nuclear weapons possessed by these countries were, any of these countries had enough nuclear weapons to completely annihilate the poor, fragile planet Earth. So that was not something that was a secret. What was a secret was the denial in the actual agenda that had been scripted for John Major, the denial of the truth about the catastrophic social problems that were being created. How the catastrophic social problems were being created by member countries like the United Kingdom, Security Council members like the United Kingdom, France, China, Russia, United States, ignoring, intentionally ignoring, intentionally ignoring the fact that the world was neglecting the plight of hundreds of millions of people, mainly in Africa and Asia, but in the other parts of the world, seeking to flee their countries, leave their countries of origin, because they wanted to escape lack of food, lack of shelter, lack of physical security, lack of human rights, lack of civil liberties in their own countries. Collectively, generally, these people are called the migrants, and depending on what route they chose or are forced to choose or forced to forced and chose as a result of the being forced, were then separated as asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, whatever. So I said that the Western countries, because it was the destination countries in the West which were the targets of the people seeking asylum, they wanted to kind of reach these countries and become accepted as asylum seekers, as refuge seekers, as refugees by these countries. And I emphatically said that these countries, societies were not prepared to accept these people. And so, therefore, in order to avoid the conflict that was being created and allowed in not addressing the issues, the Western leaders and Western societies were creating catastrophic social disturbances, riots, and so on among the civilians and with the arriving people. So that is what I said essentially, but that can be, of course, extrapolated on and elaborated on and detailed and updated on empirically and temporally. That is to say, in January 1992, things were significantly, in terms of scale, things were different, of a different scale than 20 years later. Sorry, 30 years later now. But the principles were as dire as they are today. So, flash forward and come to the daily Boris Johnson graph. The daily Boris Johnson graph of Wednesday, the 17th of August 2022. The daily Boris Johnson graph is the de facto name that I have given it. The formally published name is, of course, the Daily Telegraph. But because the owners of the Daily, Boris Johnson Graph, bribed Boris Johnson to the tunes of millions of pounds in the years that Johnson was being groomed to become the leader of the Conservative Party. Johnson was bribed and bought and kind of auctioned by the owners of the Boris Johnson Group, the so called Barclays brothers. And the Barclays brothers, being two billionaires, belonged ideologically to the big business club and ideologically subscribed to the big business agenda that the particular instrument called the UK state was going to be implemented through. And so Boris Johnson would be as a certainly, definitely, definitely well touted future leader of the Conservative Party. I'm talking about the time in 2012, let's say, was going to be seen as a pragmatic, practical investment by the investors, the Barclays brothers, acting on behalf ideologically of all the big businesses operating from the city of London and from other places, collectively treating the United Kingdom as the biggest offshore facilitator in the world. So they wanted to complete the process, complete the job, and turn the United Kingdom into complete full-time offshore criminal gangsters operations for the benefit of big businesses. Now that is in contrast, was in contrast, will remain in contrast to the power, which is nil, that the migrants, already arrived migrants or would-be migrants or asylum seekers have vis-a-vis the behavior of the government in the UK at any time. And so therefore, and the plight personally, the plight, the suffering, and the threat that each would-be asylum seeker kind of faced and still faces from the various factors at home or on the way to the West, the threat was many thousand times bigger than the threat faced by any of the billionaires. So, on the humanitarian level, on the humanitarian kind of criteria, the humanitarian policy making Western government would be perfectly entitled to, and actually is obliged to, or would have been obliged to, meet the needs of the people in the countries of origin of the desperate situation. But those people are not being helped, or are not being helped. Now, they were not being helped in January 1992, and they have not been helped in the last 30 years since the broadcast that I made. And there is no sign that any agency of the United Nations organization has been doing anything. Yet the fact is that the mainstream, it couldn't be more mainstream than the main news bulletin carried by the and carried on the and broadcast by the Channel 4 news organization in the United Kingdom. it was instantaneously relayed and broadcast right across the planet. And the contents of my broadcast, my image, they are all there on the archives and actively accessible. And yet, for 30 years, neither the contents of the broadcast nor the agenda that I was summarizing there or advocating there, to my knowledge, has been actually addressed by the United Nations organization or its executive agencies. One of the executive agencies is, of course, the Commission of the United Nations organization that is headed currently by the South American woman Michelle Bachelet or Bachelet or Bachelet. Michelle Bachelet has just ended a so-called 4-day trip to Bangladesh. Now, Bachelet is an ignorant, racist, imperialist, corrupt woman who compromised the actual evidence of the Chinese torturing, massacring, raping, genociding the Uyghur Muslims. She did that in the previous few months. So her trip to the Bangladesh state was nothing to do with her, Michelle Bachelet, suddenly becoming more considerate and more compassionate. But it was a careerist routine that she was performing in order to justify the huge money that she is paid and the facilities that she abuses. There is nothing, so far as I speak, and I speak on the 18th of August 2022 at 5:16 GMT from the United Kingdom. Nothing that Michelle Bachelet has issued or nothing that the United Nations Central Secretariat has issued suggests that she understands or the Secretariat understands that the Rohingya people must not be mistreated by the United Nations organizations, colluding with the exploiters of the Rohingya people that are consigned in and around Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, nor that the Rohingya people scattered across the world, including Indonesia, Malaysia, and other countries, that these desperate people who survived could actually reach. The Rohingya people have not been treated, and they are not being treated with anything like the urgency, the compassion, the solidarity, the support that they deserve and they have deserved from the word go. Go back to the report that was associated with one of the former incumbents in the post of Secretary General, the Ghanaian bureaucrat Kofi Annan. Now, because of the corrupt diversity display tokenism practiced by the imperialists, Kofi Annan, being a black person but reaching the post of the United Nations Secretary General, was being embarrassingly patted on the back and praised at the slightest excuse and kind of provocation. Kofi Annan did not do anything. Kofi Annan did not do anything while he was in post for 2 terms, I think, to carry out the founding aims and purposes of the United Nations. As I say, Dag Hammarskjöld, the Swedish incumbent in the post of the Secretary General of the United Nations Organization, Doug Hammarskjöld, was intentionally murdered by the forces that didn't want the United Nations to exist, let alone to deliver any of these its founding agendas and aims. So all the others that took office in the office of the Secretary General following the murder in Africa of Dag Hammarskjöld, they have been, as they were bound to be, departures from various high ideals that Dag Hammarskjöld had committed himself to as the first Secretary General of the United Nations Organization. So Kofi Annan, when he was retired, was asked by Antonio Guterres, the current incumbent in the post of Secretary General of the United Nations Organization, to undertake a kind of token research and report and investigation and probe into the Burmese massacre of the Muslims of Rohingya. Kofi Annan duly did that, and the emphasis on the word genocide was absolutely unavoidable because the evidence was unavoidable that genocide had been taking place, rapes had been taking place, murders had been taking place, massacres had been taking place. So Kofi Annan produced a report that did include the word genocide. And the United Nations bureaucracy in publicizing Kofi Annan's report had no alternative but to use the word genocide. That was much to the annoyance, much to the intention, much to the kind of desire, much to the purpose, much to the opposition to the intention of Antonio Guterres, because he wanted to give the all clear to the Burmese massacreist regime that was fronted by the murderous massacre genocidist Aung San Suu Kyi. And Suu Kyi is, of course, in strategic terms, in terms of the world domination against the Muslims by the Hindutva carrying regime of India fronted by Narendra Modi, aided and abetted by his co-criminal Amit Shah. So Aung San Suu Kyi was being congratulated by Narendra Modi. Literally within weeks of the news of the Burmese genocide of the Muslim Rohingyas hitting the world, and Modi flew to Rangoon, which is called Yangon now, and congratulated Aung San Suu Kyi by using vague terms. He didn't say he was congratulating her for murdering, massacring, raping, and violating the Muslims of Rohingya. But words to the effect that amounted to all of those were mouthed and uttered and put in the formal agreement, what is called the communique, issued jointly by Modi and his hostess, the murderous hostess, the genocidist hostess, Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, upon his return to India, Modi had set about creating as many obstructions to any Rohingya fleeing the massacre and genocide in Burma. So, as we speak on the 18th of August 2022, there are literally thousands of Rohingyas across this huge country, India, where the Rohingyas are seeking to settle down with a modicum of safety and security. But they are being prevented from that, they are being denied that by the constant program of harassment that Narendra Modi had put in place, set about after his meeting with Aung San Suu Kyi in 2017, 2018. As for Bangladesh, let me just spell out the basic benefit that the regime in Bangladesh has been getting by default. Bangladesh is known for the evidence as one of the world's most corrupt states. And Bangladesh was not an attractive investment target or destination. And this happened over decades until the Rohingyas were massacred so brutally and in such a dramatic fashion that the brutality and the massacre and genocide and rape and murders could not be concealed from international media, nor could the fact that millions of Rohingyas were seeking the next country, nearest country to their home, which is Bangladesh, to escape to from Burma. As that happened, as that happened, Bangladesh, the most notorious country, the most corrupt state, suddenly found, cynically found, corruptly found, that it could join the Burmese junta in exploiting the Rohingyas in a different way, of course. So it began to decorate itself as one of the world's poorest country per capita, one of the world's per capita, one of the world's poorest countries, having having to accommodate these million strong victims of Burmese genocide. And as instantaneous as it has been, many of the Western countries and many of the independent supporters rushed hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aid and made that aid available not to the Rohingyas, but they made that available to the head of the Bangladesh government, Sheikh Hasina. Now, Sheikh Hasina had never ever dreamt that she would be receiving that kind of money. And yet she was flooded with offers and she could not believe her luck. She was celebrating the massacre of the Rohingyas. She was delighted with the massacre of the Rohingyas. She was contemptuous to and of the rights of the needs of the humanity of the Rohingya victims of the massacre, genocide, rape, starvation, expulsion, terror unleashed on them by Aung San Suu Kyi and her military co-perpetrators. But Sheikh Hasina could not believe her sick luck, sick making luck of Sheikh Hasina. And she ended up with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of aid given to the Bangladesh state. Now, it is time now to demand that the United Nations, Michelle Bachelet, publishes the fullest known and fullest retrievable evidence of the fullest amounts of money that the Western countries have paid to the Sheikh Hasina regime in the last 5 6 calendar years under the banner of the help for the Rohingya people. We shall be updating on all of that in due course, of course. And we shall be addressing Michelle Bachelet directly, as we shall address Anthony Guterres. Now we go back to Pakistan for the updates, and we shall be doing that in a few minutes. We break here for this. This edition is breaking at 35 minutes at 05:30 GMT. We'll come back with the next part within the next hour.